The terrifying night in the quiet Portland suburbs. It started as an ordinary night in May of 2004. The suburban neighborhood of Maple Crest, just outside of Portland, Oregon, was entrenched in its familiar nighttime silence. Rows of modest two-story houses with neatly trimmed lawns were bathed in the pale glow of scattered porch lights and an occasional flicker from living room TVs. The air was brisk, the kind of chill that hinted that spring was reluctantly making way for summer. Most residents had already retired to bed, their blinds drawn and front doors locked, oblivious to the horror that would soon ripple through their tranquil world. At 2:13 a.m., that serenity was shattered by the heart-stopping sound of a scream, panicked, piercing, and feral. The noise echoed through the tree-lined streets, jarring neighbors awake. Porch lights flicked on one by one as curious, sleep-deprived faces peered out from curtained windows. To the residents of Maple Crest, loud disturbances were rare. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where drama unfolded on the streets, let alone unearthly screams in the middle of the night. The source of the chaos was the Smith residence at 113 Willow Lane, a small white house toward the cul-de-sac. When concerned neighbor Georgia Adley, an elderly woman known for keeping an eagle eye on the street, shuffled out of her home with a flashlight, she noticed something strange. The front door of the Smith house was ajar, the porch light swinging slightly in the cold night breeze. Georgia had a deep, uneasy feeling pooling in her stomach. Miles, her golden retriever, began barking uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Justin Greer, another neighbor across the street, grabbed a baseball bat and debated whether to check on the Smith house himself or call the police. "You hear that scream?" he would later recount to detectives. "It sounded like nothing I've ever heard in my life. Like sheer terror, you know? I thought someone was dying in there." Inside the house, the scene was unimaginable. Officers David Roscoe and Jamie Holt from the Portland Police Department were the first to arrive at the Smiths' doorstep after a frantic 911 call placed anonymously, likely by one of the terrified neighbors. As they entered the home cautiously, flashlights in hand and weapons drawn, the discoloration of the drywall in the foyer came into focus. Blood spattered erratically across the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. The stench of iron hung heavily in the air, making both officers instinctively pull their shirts closer to their noses. The family of four had been brutally attacked. Marcus Smith, the father of the household, lay lifeless in the living room recliner, his head caved in from repeated blows. His 8-year-old son Dylan was sprawled at the foot of the sofa, clutching a stuffed dinosaur in his bloodied hand. Upstairs, 15-year-old Heather Smith's room was in disarray, shattered glass from a broken window speckling the floor. She was found face down on the rug. The mother of the family, Caroline Smith, was discovered alive but unconscious in the hallway leading to the garage. She was later rushed to Legacy Emanuel Medical Center in critical condition, with blunt force trauma to her skull and several fractures to her arms, presumed defensive wounds. The scene was surreal, like something out of a horror movie. A bloody hammer was left abandoned in the corner of the living room, the improvised murder weapon. Footprints, marked with mud, trailed through the house, starting from Heather's room and ending at the living room window that had been pried open violently by the killer. In the kitchen, chairs were toppled, and a plate of half-eaten lasagna sat cold on the table, eerily untouched amidst the chaos. Forensics later confirmed that the killer had likely entered through the backyard, a section partially concealed by thick bushes, and gained access via the unlocked living room window. It was a crime so meticulously brutal, yet chillingly unhurried. Whoever had done this had taken their time, ensuring that no one in the household was left unscathed. By dawn, the once quiet cul-de-sac was swarmed with patrol cars, crime scene investigators, and even local news vans. Distraught neighbors gathered in small, gossiping clusters, their faces pale and grief-stricken. Channel 6 News aired the headline, "Brutal Family Murders Rock Maple Crest Suburbs." Parents clutched their children tighter, and some debated whether they should leave town entirely until the monster who did this was caught. But if there was one question on everyone's minds that morning, it was this: who could do something so horrific, and why? The blood-soaked scene and the community's haunting fear. The morning light cast long shadows over the quiet Maple Crest cul-de-sac, its usual calm forever shattered. The faint hum of news vans and the crackling of police radios broke the silence as yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the Smith residence. The house itself, once an unassuming two-story home with white siding, now carried an air of menace. What had happened inside would haunt not only the officers who entered but also the entire suburban community whose peace had been ripped away in one brutal night. Detective Sarah Calloway, the lead investigator for the Portland PD, arrived shortly after sunrise. Stepping out of her car, she noted the cluster of neighbors lining the street, their faces pale and drawn. Mothers clung to their children, and fathers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the Smith house. The neighborhood's energy had transformed overnight. Maplecrest felt less like home and more like a battlefield. "Detective!" Officer Roscoe called out as she approached the front yard. His voice was tense, gravelly, like he hadn't slept in days. "You're going to want to prepare yourself before stepping inside." Calloway drew a deep breath. She had solved homicides before, been around her share of grim scenes, but the look in Roscoe's eyes told her this was something else entirely. She nodded, donning latex gloves and booties before crossing the threshold. Inside, the stench hit her immediately, a thick metallic tang of blood mixed with the sickly sweetness of decay. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to push through it. The entryway was chaos incarnate, furniture overturned, a shattered picture frame hanging crooked on the wall. The faint indentation of a muddy boot print trailed toward the staircase. The living room was the epicenter of horror. "Jesus Christ," Calloway muttered under her breath, momentarily gripping the doorframe for balance. This was no random burglary gone wrong, it was calculated madness. Marcus Smith sat in his recliner, or rather what was left of him, was entirely caved in, his blood pooling into the cushions and dripping onto the floor below. Next to him, Dylan, just 8 years old, lay crumpled at the base of the couch. His tiny fingers still clutched a stuffed dinosaur, its once vivid colors now soaked crimson. Calloway had to look away, bile rising in her throat as she imagined what those final moments must have been like. Upstairs, the horror only deepened. In Heather Smith's room, shards of glass from the shattered window glittered across the carpet. Posters of pop stars and school dance flyers covered the walls, remnants of an ordinary teenage life that had now been extinguished. Heather had been struck from behind, her body lifeless on the bedroom floor. Outside the window, the garden below showed clear signs of disturbance. A bent bush, trampled dirt where the killer had entered and escaped. The hallway leading to the garage told its own grim story. Caroline Smith, the lone survivor, had evidently fought back. Bloodstains streaked the walls where she had clawed or fallen, and her injuries, later described by paramedics as defensive wounds, painted a picture of horrifying desperation. She had only narrowly escaped the same fate as the rest of her family, now fighting for her life in a sterile hospital room. In the corner of the living room, abandoned near the empty plate of cold lasagna, lay the murder weapon. It was a hammer, its wooden handle smeared with blood. The brutal simplicity of it sent a shiver down Calloway's spine. This wasn't some high-tech scheme or even a crime of convenience. There was something personal, grotesque, and deeply unhinged about using such an intimate, brutal tool. "Whoever did this," Roscoe said from behind her, his voice low and steady, "wanted them all dead, every single one, and they made damn sure it happened." Calloway glanced over her shoulder, nodding grimly. "This isn't just some robbery gone wrong, this was rage, focused, deliberate. We're not dealing with a crime of passion here, this is a monster." In the community, word of the murders spread faster than wildfire through Maplecrest. By mid-morning, journalists had arrived, hungry for any semblance of a headline. Helicopters buzzed overhead as news anchors delivered grim bulletins. "Family slaughtered in grisly suburban murder." Over at the Maplecrest coffee shop, a small group of neighbors sat huddled at one of the corner tables. Their hushed whispers mixed with the soft clattering of mugs and plates. "Did you hear what they're saying?" one woman, clutching a steaming cup, asked nervously. "They used a hammer, a damn hammer, can you even imagine?" Another neighbor shook his head, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the table. "I thought stuff like this only happened in movies or the big city. Not here. Not in our neighborhood." At the grocery store, parents frantically tugged their children closer. The unspeakable violence had shaken Maplecrest to its core, piercing the bubble of suburban safety that residents had taken for granted. By the day's end, local hardware and home improvement stores reported a surge in sales: door locks, security cameras, motion detectors. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness seemed heavier than usual, creeping into every corner, every shadow. "I couldn't sleep last night," one neighbor confessed to Georgia Adley, the woman who had heard the first scream. "Every creak, every rustle of the trees, I thought it was him." For Georgia, the horror clung to her like a second skin. Even Miles, her ever-protective golden retriever, seemed tense, pacing the house and barking at nothing in particular. "He has a sense about these things," Georgia told her sister over the phone. Miles knows something's not right, and neither do I. By the time the sun rose on the second day after the murders, many in Maplecrest were already considering whether to move. "I don't care if it takes months to sell this damn house," Justin Greer told his wife Sarah as they watched the news in their dimly lit living room. "We're leaving. Whatever the hell this was, I'm not sticking around to find out if he comes back." But for Calloway and her team at the Portland PD, leaving wasn't an option. Maplecrest had gone from a quaint suburban neighborhood to the hunting ground for an elusive predator, and until they found him, the air of paranoia would only tighten its grip. The first clues detective Sarah Calloway sat slouched over the briefing table in the makeshift command center. A spare room outfitted in the local precinct with folding chairs, a corkboard littered with crime scene photos, and a glaring fluorescent light overhead. The air inside was heavy with exhaustion and caffeine fumes. Calloway rubbed her temples, scanning the preliminary crime scene report spread in front of her. "So, no sign of forced entry, except for the window which was pried open once the murders started?" she asked aloud, addressing the team of investigators and forensic technicians gathered in the room. "Right," Officer Roscoe confirmed, leaning against the wall with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had been one of the first officers on the scene. "Everything else was locked up tight. Whoever did this planned it. They scoped the house, made sure they could get in with minimal noise." Calloway pointed at a grainy photo pinned to the board, a close-up of the muddy boot print left at the base of the staircase inside the house. "What about this?" she asked, tapping her pen on the picture. "Size 12. Bigger than anyone in the Smith family, right?" "Forensics confirmed it," cut in Jamie Diaz, the lead technician, flipping open a binder. "The mud sample isn't native to the Smiths' lawn or even their backyard. It's definitely from somewhere else. The material has traces of clay and fine silt. I think it probably came from a wooded or marshy area nearby." Calloway processed this information, her mind piecing together the fragments of the awful story. "So, they didn't just walk off the street. This guy came from somewhere specific, woods maybe. He didn't just accidentally stumble in." "We also found traces of black fibers," Diaz added. She rummaged through her notes. "Could be from a jacket or work gloves. We're running comparison tests now." Roscoe squinted at the printout. "Mud, fibers. This guy's not exactly careful about cleaning up after himself, huh?" "Oh, he's careful, Roscoe," Calloway countered, her tone sharp. "Leaving the hammer, leaving these little breadcrumbs. None of this is an accident. He's bold. The way he single-handedly took out a family of 4 like it was nothing. This is someone with power, control. He's deliberate, even if he pretends not to be." Across the room, another officer stepped forward, a clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, we've got something else you might want to hear," she said hesitantly. "Georgia Adley, you know, the neighbor who originally called in the scream, mentioned seeing a man earlier that day." Calloway immediately perked up, narrowing her eyes. "What kind of man?" "She said he wasn't from the neighborhood. Tall, broad shoulders, maybe 6 feet or more. She mentioned he had a kind of rough look about him. Wore a dark jacket and carried a small bag over one shoulder. She said she thought it was odd because he was just sitting at the bus stop down the road, not taking the bus, just watching." The information hung in the air like a sudden shift of wind before a storm. "When did this happen?" Calloway pressed. "Early evening," she said. "Around 7 p.m. Wasn't much light left." Calloway's finger traced an imaginary timeline in the air as she thought aloud. "Waiting, watching. A man like that doesn't just stake out for hours unless he knows what he's looking for. This guy was focused." "What stands out to me," the officer added, "is she said that later, about 10 minutes before the scream, Miles, her dog, started barking at the same direction down the street. But by then the man was gone." Roscoe leaned forward, finally showing renewed interest. "So who's this mystery guy? Did she get a good look at his face?" The officer shook her head apologetically. "Said he had a baseball cap on, kept his head down." A somber silence settled over the room. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. Just the tiniest sliver of a lead to chase. The hammer. "What about the hammer?" Calloway asked abruptly. "Any news on where it came from?" Diaz flipped open another folder, this one filled with close-up images of the murder weapon. "Yeah, that's complicated. It's a standard claw hammer, probably bought from a home improvement store. Problem is, there are hundreds of places in a 50-mile radius where he could have purchased this exact model. There's nothing distinctive about it, no serial numbers, no unique scratches, nada. But," Diaz added, holding up an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a broken price sticker, "the handle had remnants of adhesive, probably had a price tag on it at some point. That tells us it could be relatively new. Somebody bought this not too long ago." Calloway spun her pen in her fingers nervously. The picture of the Smith family flashed into her mind, Marcus slumped in his chair, Dylan on the floor clutching his bloody stuffed dinosaur, Heather's shattered window. This wasn't someone's spur-of-the-moment decision. The first anonymous tip. Before the team could disperse, another officer burst into the room, his face flush with urgency. "Detective, you need to hear this. We just got a call from a hardware store out in Gresham. A clerk there says they remember selling a hammer a few days ago to a guy that fits George's description. Tall, rough-looking, quiet, except he paid in cash and didn't say much besides, just the hammer." Walked out without hesitation. Calloway's adrenaline spiked. "Gresham, that's..." She hesitated, mentally plotting the proximity. "About 40 minutes from Maple Crest," the officer supplied. "This guy didn't just pick Portland out of nowhere," Calloway muttered. "He was planning this. Calculating. He moved through this town like a damn ghost, but he's leaving fragments, the hammer, the mud, the neighbors noticing him. It's like he's organized but arrogant enough that he thinks he's untouchable." She turned to the team. "I need a deeper canvas immediately. Expand the radius. Look for any sightings, any weird activity involving a man who fits George's description." Roscoe sighed and grabbed his phone. "I'll coordinate with the local precincts, see about getting some surveillance footage near the bus stops and hardware stores." As the team sprang into action, Calloway stayed rooted at the table, staring intently at the single boot print on the corkboard. It was like staring into the footprint of a nightmare, and whoever left it was still out there, not running scared but calm, calculating, planning the next steps. The pieces were falling into place, albeit slowly. Muddy boots, fibers, a hammer hastily purchased. They were fragments of a puzzle that might someday show the twisted face of the person behind the Smith family's brutal demise. For now, however, they were crumbs along the path, and the predators always knew how to cover their trails. The spreading terror. The Smith murders didn't just shock the quiet suburban enclave of Maple Crest, they ignited a wildfire of fear that ricocheted across neighboring towns and into every corner of Oregon. Within weeks of that horrifying night, whispers of a shadowy figure armed with a hammer and an insatiable appetite for violence began to grow louder. For those who had brushed it off as an isolated tragedy, that illusion shattered when the second attack occurred. It was the morning of June 18, 2004, in Ashdale, a similarly peaceful neighborhood nestled along the Columbia Gorge. Just like before, in the dead of night, screams pierced the quiet air. This time it was the Martinez family, a father, mother, and a teenage daughter. When first responders arrived, it was déjà vu, a family attacked without mercy. The house was filled with the same erratic patterns of blood spatter on walls and floors. The mother, Emily Martinez, was found alive but critically injured at the base of her stairs, while the father, Jorge, and their 16-year-old daughter, Maria, were pronounced dead at the scene. A hammer, bloodied and abandoned near the porch, bore the horrifying mark of a killer who was growing bolder. A community frozen in fear. Detective Calloway's phone buzzed at 3:16 a.m. She barely had to glance at the caller ID to know what it was about. She'd been awaiting another call, almost hoping it wouldn't come. "No," she muttered to herself, already pulling on her jacket. "Not again." When she arrived at the Martinez crime scene hours later, the look on Officer Roscoe's face confirmed her worst fears. "It's him, Calloway," he said flatly, gesturing toward the house. "Same goddamn thing, same weapon, same fury." The Portland PD homicide unit was now scrambling under mounting public pressure. News channels churned out hour after hour coverage labeling the suspect with ominous monikers like the Hammer Butcher or the Suburban Slayer. But what gnawed at Calloway late at night wasn't just the unpredictability of the man they were hunting, it was the methodical precision. This wasn't chaos, this was controlled violence, this wasn't random, this was deliberate. Calloway stood in the Martinez's living room, soaking in every detail, the overturned coffee table, the blood pooled on the hardwood floor. It felt like déjà vu. "Third one this month, isn't it?" she whispered to Roscoe. "Yeah. And it's escalating," he replied grimly. "First it was the Smiths, now the Martinezes. Each time he's quicker, more efficient. He's learning." But what kept Calloway and her team up at night wasn't just the killer's increasing confidence, it was their inability to predict where he might strike next. The panic begins. Within days of the Martinez murders, panic spread like ripples in a pond. Fear gripped communities to the point where mundane, everyday sounds, a distant dog barking, a car door slamming, suddenly felt like a prelude to something sinister. Newspaper headlines screamed of a serial killer stalking the suburbs, accompanied by grainy, speculative sketches of a faceless man in a dark cap, each more abstract and unsettling than the last. Parents began pulling their kids out of summer activities. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up overnight, groups of terrified locals patrolling the streets with flashlights and bats. Home improvement stores sold out of padlocks, motion sensor lights, and security cameras. Hardware aisle workers jokingly started calling it hammer-proofing your home, though no one was actually laughing. In Ashdale, the residents turned themselves into makeshift fortresses. On one street, nearly every house installed spotlights in their driveways. The soft glow of porch lights was replaced with harsh beams of LED-powered vigilance. One elderly man reportedly slept with a hammer of his own under his pillow, claiming, "If the bastard comes to my door, I'm going to show him what's what." Copycats, prank calls, and mass hysteria. The panic reached a fever pitch by late July as rumors of additional murders, mostly unconfirmed or exaggerated, spiraled out of control. Social media posts from surrounding states alleged hammer butcher sightings in Idaho and southern Washington. Calloway dismissed most of them as hoaxes, well-meaning citizens jumping at shadows, but her growing map of dotted attack sites painted a grim picture of the killer's movements. He wasn't confined to one area. He was mobile, an elusive ghost haunting the Northwest. The incident reports started coming in even when no real crimes had occurred. Families called 911 to report unfamiliar cars parked down their streets or strangers taking too long at a bus stop. One man in the nearby town of Birchwood pulled a shotgun on a home inspector who came unannounced. "Can you blame them?" Roscoe muttered, reviewing the mountain of false alarms. "Half these people weren't locking their doors 6 months ago. Now they're barricading themselves in like it's a damn zombie apocalypse." What unnerved Calloway the most, however, weren't the prank calls or fearful overreactions. It was the whispers from her colleagues in other states, details of unsolved murders that bore uncanny resemblance to their cases. The same brutality, the same weapon, the same lack of motive. "Think he's trying to start a legacy?" Roscoe asked one evening during a strategy meeting. Calloway didn't answer for a long time, staring instead at the grainy footprint photos taken from the Smith and Martinez homes. Finally she muttered, "I think he already has." The third family. On August 10, 2004, it happened again. A young couple in Evergreen Heights, Oregon was found dead in their living room, their newborn unharmed but left crying in the nursery. The police wondered briefly if mercy played any part in sparing the child, but Calloway was adamant, no mercy, he didn't even go upstairs. That baby was just inconsequential to him. The press had a field day with this one. The lone survivor, the infant, became a gruesome symbol of survival amidst carnage. The Portland Post ran a front-page story with the chilling headline, "The Butcher Leaves a Witness." More fear, more chaos. The following weeks were filled with town hall meetings where angry residents shouted down mayoral officials demanding protection. Police worked all-night shifts following dead-end tips and chasing shadows that evaporated with every passing day. Calloway saw it in every officer's eyes, the subtle hint of hopelessness. It was as if this killer had written the script and was watching them stumble through his maze. The killer without a name. By September, the killer, who still remained nameless, had transcended into folklore. Calloway overheard a group of kids talking at a gas station one evening, boasting about some hammer man they'd seen in their backyard. They hadn't. Speak of him enough, she thought to herself, and maybe he'll appear. By this point, it wasn't the murders alone that haunted Oregon, though they did, undeniably. It was the invisible noose tightening around every community. It was the pervasive sense that no one, anywhere, was ever truly safe. And there was one question above all, that whispered in Calloway's mind late at night, the same question that sliced through the shaky, hushed conversations of an entire state. When would he strike again? The first glimpse of a suspect. The mood at the Portland PD was tense. After 3 weeks of chasing leads that turned to dust, the homicide unit was at a standstill. Tips poured in, each one more absurd than the last. Psychics claiming they sensed the killer's energy. Neighbors reporting innocent gardeners as suspicious because they carried tools. It was as if the weight of the case had trapped everyone in a suffocating fog of uncertainty. Detective Sarah Calloway wasn't untouched by that fog, but her instinct hadn't dulled. Every day she circled back to the same questions. Why the Smiths? Why the Martinezes? What had made those families his target while the houses next door remained untouched? The randomness felt anything but random. It felt calculated, and then, like a cruel trick played by fate, a sliver of light pierced through the haze. The thrift store tip. Detective Calloway, a uniformed officer, knocked sharply on the conference room door. Calloway had been staring at the board of photographs, the crime scene images, and footprint sketch tacked between the pictures of victims. She snapped out of her thoughts, a weary sigh escaping her lips. "What is it?" she asked curtly. "There's a woman on the phone," the young officer said nervously, gripping the edge of the door. "She works at one of those thrift shops by Hawthorne. Says something about a guy buying tools not long before the Smith murders. It might be nothing, but—" Calloway didn't wait for him to finish. Her radio headset was draped over the edge of the table. She grabbed it in one motion, signaling to route the call to her line. A moment later, a thin, tired voice crackled through her earpiece. "Miss Adkins?" Calloway said, her tone sharpening with interest. "This is Detective Calloway with the Portland PD. You mentioned a man buying a hammer?" "Yes," the woman stammered, her words shaky despite her obvious intent to be helpful. "It just stuck with me, you know? It's not like I see a lot of big purchases around here. Most folks come in for old furniture or clothes." "What about this man caught your attention?" Calloway asked, leaning forward in her chair and grabbing the case notebook, flipping to a fresh page. "Well," Adkins hesitated before continuing, "he just gave me a bad vibe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 6'1" or 2, late 40s I'd say, rough-looking, you know, unshaven like he'd been out in the woods." "And the hammer?" Calloway pressed, her pen moving furiously as she wrote down notes. "It wasn't just a hammer," Adkins clarified nervously. "He bought a knife too, one of those cheap ones we sometimes have in the glass case, and rope. Weird combo, right? I thought maybe he was working construction or camping or something, but—" Her voice trailed off for a moment. "But he didn't say much, not even chit-chat. He just said, 'These'll do,' and went straight to the register." Calloway's pen stopped mid-scrawl. "Did he pay cash?" "Yes," Adkins said quickly, "all cash. He had this old leather wallet, tattered. I remember because he fumbled with it for a second, like he wasn't used to buying things." Calloway's brow furrowed. "Did he drive? Did you see his car?" "No," Adkins replied, disappointment creeping into her voice. "We're right next to the bus stop on Hawthorne. I didn't follow where he went after he left, but I figured he must have walked or taken the bus." The bus stop. The image clicked almost instantly in Calloway's head. Georgia Adley's earlier report of the strange man at the bus stop near Maplecrest, sitting there at twilight, not seeming to wait for anything in particular. A man who had vanished before the scream shattered the night, piecing it together. 15 minutes later, Calloway stormed into the squad room, her notebook in hand and adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Listen up," she barked, drawing the attention of the officers around her. "We might have our first legitimate lead. A thrift store clerk on Hawthorne had contact with someone buying tools, a hammer, rope. Matches the description given by Georgia Adley weeks back." Roscoe, seated near the far window with a cup of coffee in hand, perked up. "The bus stop guy?" he asked, sitting up straighter. Calloway nodded. "Tall, rough-looking, mid to late 40s, not local, probably cash-heavy. She mentioned something else, too. He looked like he'd been camping or hiking." She paced as she spoke, flipping through her notebook. "The fibers we found at the Smith scene, wool or synthetic, we theorize they were from outdoor gear. This lines up." "You think he's drifting between towns?" Roscoe asked, narrowing his eyes at the timeline posted on the board. "If he doesn't drive—" "Exactly," Calloway said sharply. "He's sticking to bus routes, not just in Portland but surrounding towns. Ashdale, Gresham, all within reach of regional transit lines. The guy knows his way around, but he's careful not to stay long." Another officer chimed in, flipping through a file. "I called TriMet about cameras at the Hawthorne stop. They don't keep footage more than 7 days unless someone requests it. If he traveled through there, we're too late to catch him on video." "Doesn't mean we're out of leads," Calloway muttered, scanning the room. "We need to track down other stores within walking distance of bus stations, especially anything that might sell weapons, outdoor gear, or tools. Start pulling possible receipts for cash purchases in the past month." "What about bolos for transit hubs?" Roscoe asked. "If we circulate his description, someone might spot him." "We'll try that too," Calloway said, though her tone was cautious. "But we need to move quietly. He's stayed invisible this long because he's good at disappearing. If he catches wind that we're onto him, he'll go deeper underground." A shadow of a man, sitting back at her desk later that night, Calloway stared at the sketched outline of the man described by both Georgia Adley and Miss Adkins, a faceless figure in a dark jacket, his features cloaked in shadow. To the world around him he was a drifter, a specter passing unnoticed through neighborhoods, thrift stores, and bus stops. But in Calloway's mind, he wasn't invisible at all. He was methodical, deliberate, and effective. The tools he bought weren't just tools. They were pieces of a ritual, objects imbued with his deadly intent. And while others saw a faceless man, Calloway saw something far darker in him, a predator who moved freely through the cracks of society, leaving devastation in his wake. "We're getting closer," Calloway whispered quietly to the darkened office, though no one was there to hear her. But so is he. The mystery of the killer's mind. Detective Sarah Calloway sat in the dimly lit corner of the Portland Precinct's profiling room. The walls were lined with case files and grainy photographs of suspects long since convicted. But the one case that dominated the whiteboard, a scribbled mess of theories, psychological guesses, and scrawled connections, was the Oregon butcher. She leaned back in her chair, massaging the bridge of her nose, while the voice of Dr. Eleanor Hart echoed through the room. "This isn't a typical serial killer," Dr. Hart began, standing in front of the team of investigators. Dr. Hart was the Portland PD's go-to criminal psychologist, her sharp mind a critical weapon in cases like this. Wearing a sleek black blazer and speaking with deliberate authority, she didn't sugarcoat her analysis. The method, the weapon, and the sheer brutality, these are meticulously chosen. They're not accidents, not fits of passion. They're part of the narrative this killer is crafting, a narrative we're just beginning to decipher. Calloway glanced at Roscoe across the table. "He's crafting a narrative?" she asked doubtfully. "Or he's just a psychotic out of control?" Hart's expression didn't falter. "Control is exactly what defines him, detective. This isn't your average spree killing. He didn't just snap out of desperation. Think about it. Every single detail about him screams precision. The hammer, the footprints, the windows he uses to slip in and out, they're deliberate, like signatures." The profiling team around the table remained silent. Calloway flipped open her notebook. "So what's driving him? Rage? Power?" "Both," Hart said pointedly, "and maybe more." She moved to the board where the photos of the victims hung side by side. "What's fascinating about this killer is the repeated use of the hammer. It's brutally simple, cold, and devastating. A gun or a knife would have been less personal. But a hammer? With that you have to get close. You have to look your victim in the eye, or in the case of the Smith boy, not even give him a fighting chance." Roscoe leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Okay, so it's personal, we already guessed that. But what kind of person does this? We're not talking robbery, revenge, or your average heat-of-the-moment crime." Hart smirked faintly at his frustration, crossing her arms as she turned back to the room. "We're talking about someone likely shaped by deep psychological trauma, maybe rejection, maybe abuse. He doesn't just view these murders as killings, he probably views them as acts of empowerment, a way to regain or reinforce control after a life of being stripped of it. The hammer isn't just his weapon, it's his symbol." Calloway scribbled down notes furiously. "Symbol of what?" Hart paused, choosing her words like a surgeon choosing a scalpel. "Dominance, strength maybe, or revenge against some specific aspect of his past that we don't fully understand yet. Let me give you some context. This guy," she tapped the crime photos for emphasis, "isn't new to violence. Someone who kills like this, with this much savage precision, didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to murder entire families. This is practiced. It's rehearsed, even if just in his thoughts." "Are you saying he's done this before?" Roscoe shifted uncomfortably. Hart nodded. "Yes. Maybe not to this exact level of escalation, but his rage, his process, these are refined. I'd bet just about anything that he's practiced violence before in some form, whether on animals, smaller crimes, or possibly even under aliases we haven't connected yet." Calloway exhaled sharply, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "So he's smart, angry, precise, but he doesn't leave much behind. No fingerprints, no hair, no clear motive. We know he's hiding behind this drifter facade, moving between transit systems and disappearing into the woods. But why the families? Why pick people like the Smiths or the Martinezes?" Hart's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing at the open crime scene photographs. "That is the critical question. Why families? It could mean he sees something in them, a representation of stability, love, happiness, things he feels were stolen from him. In his mind he could be thinking, if I can't have this, then no one can. That kind of mentality is common in offenders who suffered long-term severe emotional trauma." Roscoe let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "So, what? Every family is a potential target?" "If he escalates further, yes, but it's more likely he's selective," Hart clarified. She pointed to the scattered crime scene images. "Think of how carefully he surveyed the neighborhoods. He didn't pick random houses, he studied them. He picked the Smiths for a reason, and then he studied them long enough to know their patterns, their routines. This isn't an opportunistic predator, this is a hunter. The origin of the killer's rage." As the team hashed through case details, Hart placed a file in front of Calloway, notes and clinical research on past serial offenders with similar patterns. "Now let me theorize something," she said. "This is speculative, but stay with me." Calloway raised an eyebrow, listening intently. "Imagine this man as a child. He grows up in a hostile, violent environment. Maybe his parents, if present, were abusive, neglectful, or absent entirely. He internalized those experiences, but instead of lashing out immediately, he grew quiet, withdrawn. Then that anger started to boil, but he still hid it. Maybe he experimented with cruelty, harming animals or lashing out in small ways. He learned to suppress his feelings until they became white-hot rage, which eventually exploded into this." Calloway gestured to the photos on the board. "Exactly," Hart replied, "but here's the twist. He's not just some enraged kid throwing a tantrum as a grown man. He's turned his anger into structure. These killings aren't accidents, they're a system, almost ritualistic. For him, every swing of that hammer is more than an act of violence. It's an act of control, maybe even catharsis." Calloway frowned. "Catharsis? You're saying he's enjoying this?" Hart shook her head faintly. "Not exactly. Enjoyment might not be the right word. It's more like he's feeding something. Every life he takes feeds this bottomless pit inside him. He's likely haunted by something from his past he can't shake. Killing is his way of momentarily quieting that storm." "That's the scary part," Roscoe chimed in grimly, "because it means he might never stop." "Not unless we stop him first," Calloway said flatly, determination anchoring her words. Inside the mind of a predator. That night, as Calloway sat alone in her office, Hart's words echoed in her mind. She stared at an empty coffee cup on her desk, her mind replaying the brutal images of the Smith and Martinez scenes. The puzzle pieces of the killer's mind swirled together, a man driven by rage, shaped by trauma, and meticulously creating his own twisted legacy. But one question still haunted her above all else. If this killer was hunting, what was he looking for? The killer crosses state lines. By early September 2004, the investigation into the Oregon butcher was no longer just Portland's problem. What had started as a staggering series of suburban murders within Oregon had now morphed into a widening nightmare, one with no borders and no clear endpoint. A new murder scene, viciously reminiscent of the Smith and Martinez family atrocities, turned up just over the border in Washington state. Two sisters, 14 and 10, were killed in a small home on the outskirts of Vancouver, Washington. Detective Sarah Calloway's phone rang before dawn. Her hand instinctively moved to silence the blaring sound, but when she saw the early hour and the contact, Washington State Police, she bolted upright. Bad news never waited until sunrise. The Vancouver murders. The home was modest, a little single-story place tucked away on a quiet suburban street. Calloway leaned on the hood of her car, staring grimly across the lawn that now crawled with state police officers. Yellow tape enveloped the property like a noose, reporters gathering just beyond its reach. Detective Tom Houseman, a grizzled investigator in his mid-50s with the Washington State Police, greeted her with a handshake firm enough to signal both his authority and his worry. "Thanks for coming," Houseman said gruffly. "Figured you'd want in on this. Same goddamn signature as your Oregon guy." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "The hammer?" Houseman nodded. "Hammer, precision, brutality. The bastard even left muddy boot prints. Victims were Julia and Ellie Ransom, sisters. Parents were out of town at a medical conference, the girls were home alone." Steeling herself, Calloway stepped through the front door and into the carnage she knew was waiting for her. It was as though someone had taken the Smith and Martinez blueprints and replicated them in horrifying detail. Curtains torn down, broken chairs, and a trail of footprints leading from the backyard straight to the murky scene in the sisters' shared bedroom. Julia lay crumpled on the carpet between her bed and the nightstand. The little one, Ellie, her school pictures pinned to a bulletin board above her bed, was sprawled on her mattress, still clutching her quilt like it could protect her from the world's worst horrors. Calloway's stomach churned. Houseman cleared his throat at her side. "I've been around long enough to see some serious shit, Calloway. But this? Kids?" His voice faltered. "What the hell kind of monster does this?" "That's the problem, isn't it?" Calloway answered, her voice distant. "We're not dealing with a person who sees monsters. He doesn't see kids, families, homes. He sees targets, a game, or maybe worse, he sees a purpose to all of this." Her hands clenched into fists. "But the thing is, he's not just staying put anymore. He's moving. A ghost in motion." By the time Calloway returned to Portland, The realization had settled in like a heavy fog. The Oregon butcher wasn't tied to a single state or city anymore. He wasn't just their problem, confined to familiar transit routes and clustered neighborhoods. He was mobile now, crossing into neighboring regions with the same calculated calm that defined his kills. He was shifting his hunting grounds, adapting as the dragnet around him tightened. Her team was already buried in maps and case files upon her arrival. A large regional map of the Pacific Northwest occupied the center of the room, marked with red pins representing incidents connected to the butcher, Maple Crest, Ashdale, Gresham, and now Vancouver. Each pin was joined to the next with thin lines of string, creating a web of terror that was spreading outward, reaching farther into unsuspecting communities. "Notice something?" Roscoe muttered, his coffee cup hovering near his lips. "He's keeping close to transit hubs. Vancouver, few blocks from a Greyhound station. The Martinez house in Ashdale, 10-minute walk from an Amtrak stop. And the Smith place, just off a major bus line. Highways, bus routes, this guy doesn't drive," Calloway said, examining the map. "That fits what we know. He's not local to any one area, moves on foot, and keeps his footprint light." "Clever bastard." "It's more than clever," Roscoe said grimly, circling another point on the map. "It's surgical. He knows exactly how to vanish the minute he's done. There's no way some amateur just hops states and keeps this clean." Calloway stared at the map in silence. The web was growing, stretching across county and state lines. It meant they'd need cooperation across multiple jurisdictions, meant sharing their limited information with other local authorities, and meant staring down a storm of media waiting to fan flames of fear. But most of all, it meant their time was running out. The FBI steps. By mid-September, the case had escalated beyond Portland PD's control. A joint task force was formalized, with the FBI stepping in to centralize operations. For Calloway, this meant one thing. The case was no longer hers to lead. In the sterile conference room of the FBI regional office, Calloway sat among agents, analysts, and state detectives from 3 states. A large projector screen displayed a profile sketch of the Oregon butcher, tall, mid to late 40s, dark jacket, baseball cap, features tenuous at best. Alongside the sketch were crime scene photos burned into Calloway's thoughts, bloodied hammers, shattered windows, and muddy boot prints. Agent Daniel Kravitz, the FBI's lead profiler, took to the podium. He had sharp, focused eyes that appeared to see through everyone in the room. "We're dealing with a highly mobile offender," Kravitz began, clicking through a series of unsettling slides. "Based on environmental factors, victimology, and geographical patterns, we believe he has a specific set of targets in mind: homes at the edge of suburban zones, families without extensive security measures, proximity to public transit. He picks locations where retreat is easy, where routes out are abundant." Calloway leaned back in her chair, jaw tightening. "So what's the plan, Agent?" "The plan is simple on paper, not so much in practice." Kravitz's tone was clipped. "We're issuing BOLOs across all public transit systems: Greyhound, Amtrak, municipal buses. We've got plainclothes officers and federal agents stationed at high-traffic hubs and cross-state transit connections. And, most importantly, we're cross-referencing unsolved cases nationwide for connections to his M.O." Calloway interjected, "Connections don't matter if he moves faster than we can react. He's already changing his patterns to keep ahead of us. You're describing someone who won't run scared when we put pressure on him. He's someone who'll adapt. Escalate." Kravitz paused, his sharp eyes locking with Calloway's. "Exactly. Which is why we need locals like you, Detective, to help spot what we're missing. No one knows his earlier work like your team does." Roscoe leaned toward Calloway, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Doesn't feel like they've got it under control, does it?" "Not even a little," Calloway muttered back, arms crossed. Beyond the line. By the end of September, the Oregon butcher wasn't just Oregon's shadow anymore. He was Washington's nightmare, and potentially Idaho's next problem. Every new location added a sense of dread to a question that loomed in Calloway's mind. Was this man running from something, or running toward it? As state officials beefed up their patrols and checkpoints, Calloway immersed herself deeper into understanding her enemy. Her notes grew tangled, her desk cluttered with maps, transit schedules, and endless witness interviews, most of which turned up nothing but dead ends. But somewhere in the chaos, one fact remained clear. He wasn't confined to a neighborhood, a town, or even a state. The way he moved, a ghost among transit lines and unguarded homes, meant that his next target could be anywhere. And every time Calloway closed her eyes, she saw the same pattern replaying: bloody rooms, shattered families, and marks left behind as if to mock their efforts to stop him. The killer had crossed state lines, and there was no telling how far his shadow would stretch next. The endless hunt. By late 2004, the Oregon butcher was no longer just a ghost haunting the Pacific Northwest. He was a phenomenon, a waking nightmare whose shadow loomed over every town from Portland to Spokane. For Detective Sarah Calloway and her team, the hunt had become something far more than a job. It was an obsession, an unrelenting fire that burned through each day and fed their exhaustion at every sleepless night. Every clue, every fingerprint smudge, every fleeting eyewitness account had the potential to be their breakthrough, or another maddening dead end. Yet, even with an FBI task force behind them, even with bolos and patrols sweeping through bus depots and train stations, the killer remained one step ahead of them. The distance between his crimes wasn't just geographical, but psychological. He wasn't running out of desperation. He was disappearing as though he'd been swallowed by the ground itself. Every murder felt methodical, timed, as if he was daring them to follow him. And they did, dragging themselves deeper into his labyrinth, hoping to catch up to a ghost. The breadcrumb trail. It was 3 a.m., and Calloway was sitting in the fluorescent hum of her office, surrounded by open files and half-empty coffee cups. Her map of pinned cities now resembled a spiderweb stretched across 3 states: the Smith family in Portland, the Martinezes in Ashdale, the sisters in Vancouver, the young couple in Evergreen Heights. She stared at the widening pattern, a traveling killer, mobile but maddeningly purposeful. Across from her, Roscoe rubbed his bloodshot eyes and leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. "This guy leaves just enough for us to chase him, you know," he said. "It's like he's enjoying this. Not the kills, not just them, though God knows he enjoys that too, but making us run after him like we're rats in his maze." Calloway tilted her head, her fingers tracing the path on the map. "It's not just the distance," she murmured, more to herself than to Roscoe. "It's the timing. 5 days between the Smiths and the Martinezes, 3 weeks until Vancouver, almost 1 month exactly until Evergreen Heights. These aren't random gaps." Roscoe frowned, leaning forward to look at her. "You think he's working on a schedule?" "Maybe," Calloway replied, her voice cold. "Or he's watching us, measuring how fast we react. It's like he knows when we're about to catch our breath, and then he hits again somewhere completely new." She ran her hand down her face, trying to shake off the suffocating frustration. "If he's this calculated, Roscoe, there's no way he's stopping. Not until we make him." "You make it sound like he's running some kind of marathon," Roscoe said bitterly. "Maybe he is." Calloway tapped the map with her pen. "But the finish line's in his head, not ours." A phantom at the edges. The frustrating part, for Calloway and everyone working the case, was how clean the killer's trail always seemed. He left just enough behind to prove he was real. Fibers from a jacket caught on a broken window frame, boot prints in the mud, the faint smudge of a fingerprint on a door handle. Every new lead felt like a promise, and every analysis came back the same, fragments of nothing. The only human thing about him wasn't what he left behind, but what he seemed to take with him. From the Smith family he had taken one of Dylan's toys, a small fire truck no one had noticed was missing until days later. At the Martinez home, a photo frame. From the Ransom sisters, Ellie's bracelet. They weren't trophies in the traditional sense. They weren't found in his hideout, or wherever in hell he disappeared to between murders, but they weren't accidentally dropped either. Calloway felt it deeply, like a second sense. These stolen pieces meant something to him. They were threads in the tapestry of his mind, and unraveling that mind was the key to catching him. The toll of the hunt. By November, the cracks in the team were beginning to show. Calloway felt it every time she stepped into the bullpen, officers too tired to hide their frustration, too frazzled to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Arguments flared more easily now, over jurisdiction calls, over resources, over ideas. One night, Roscoe finally snapped. "I mean, come on, Sarah," he said, slamming his coffee cup down so hard it cracked. "What's the point of all this? Look at the map. He could be freaking anywhere by now. Hell, for all we know, he's already left the damn country, and we're just sitting here, chasing his breadcrumbs like idiots." Calloway's response was immediate and sharp. "Do you think I don't see that, Roscoe?" Her voice shook slightly, the weight of everything pouring into her tone. "Do you think I don't feel it? That this son of a bitch is out there laughing at us? That we're always 2 steps behind him? You don't think I feel that every single night?" The room fell silent. Roscoe's eyes softened slightly, and he muttered, "Sorry, I didn't mean it like that." Calloway exhaled slowly. "I know," None of us meant for it to get this far. But it did. And now, it's up to us to fix it. She stared at the photos tacked to the board, at the terrified eyes of victims staring back at her from lifeless frames. We're not just chasing him, she continued, her voice quieter now. We're chasing closure, for them, for their families. Every day he stays free is another day they don't get answers, that they live with this. The flicker of insight. Calloway's clarity came not from a breakthrough clue, but from exhaustion. She sat in her car late one night, rain streaking across her windshield and the steady rhythm of droplets echoing in her head louder than her own thoughts. She thought of him, not as a killer, not even as a monster, but as a man. Somewhere out there, he was moving, breathing, existing like everyone else. What kept her awake at night wasn't his violence, but his purpose. He wasn't killing out of frenzy or randomness. He wasn't attacking communities on impulse. He had a destination, the invisible point around which his mind revolved like an orbiting planet. What was he chasing? Why families? Why the hammer? As if answering her own question, she whispered into the silence of her car, because he can't kill what's haunting him, so he kills who he thinks he can control. The relentless search. By the end of 2004, Calloway's team hadn't stopped. The Oregon butcher hadn't struck again in months, but no one was naive enough to believe he was gone. He's waiting for something, Calloway said at one of their quiet strategy meetings, and when he finds it, he'll kill again. The only question is whether we're there to stop him. They followed every lead, chased whispers across state lines. A forest ranger who thought he'd seen a drifter with a hammer tucked into his bag in Boise. A gas station clerk who swore she recognized him from the Portland sketch. And one chilling report from a hitchhiker in northern Washington who claimed a man had offered her a ride until she saw the hammer sitting on the passenger seat and ran. The clues painted a picture of a man just outside their grasp, always ahead of them, dancing just beyond the light. But Calloway wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Because her gut told her something no map or fingerprint analysis ever could. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The survivor clues. A sharp ring pierced the silence of the precinct one frosty evening in December 2004. Detective Calloway was sitting at her desk, chewing on the cap of her pen as she scrolled through stale case updates. The call came in from a local hospital. Someone was asking for her specifically. When the officer on the line mentioned the Oregon butcher, Calloway froze, her veins flooding with adrenaline. "Who is it?" she demanded, already grabbing her jacket. "Her name's Dana Ledbetter," the officer said. "Her story matches his M.O. She says she survived." The first real witness. Calloway and Roscoe arrived at Samaritan General Hospital as quickly as they could, their badges getting them past a grumpy night nurse and into the private room where Dana was recovering. The young woman sat upright in the hospital bed, a thin blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her pale face was patterned with bruises, her left arm in a heavy cast. But it was her eyes that stopped Calloway in her tracks, dark, sunken, and roving, as if she were still being hunted. "Dana," Calloway said carefully, taking a seat near the bedside while Roscoe leaned against the wall. "I'm Detective Calloway and this is Officer Roscoe. We're investigating the person who did this to you." She avoided using the word killer for now. "We know this will be hard, but whatever you can tell us might save lives." Dana locked eyes with Calloway, her hands twitching nervously in her lap. He was a monster," she whispered, "but not in the way you think." Calloway tilted her head, leaning forward gently. "What do you mean?" "The attack." Dana recounted the nightmare in halting, trembling breaths. She had been walking home late from her job as a waitress in Gresham, taking her usual shortcut through a quiet residential street just past midnight. She wasn't afraid. This was her route every night and nothing had ever happened before, and then she saw him. "He came out of nowhere," Dana said, her voice cracking. "At first I thought he was just a drunk, tall, scruffy, you know. His jacket looked soaked like he'd been out in the rain too long." "What did his face look like?" Calloway asked, keeping her voice calm, though her pulse was racing. Dana hesitated. "That's the thing. I didn't see it. He was wearing a cap pulled low, and when he got close enough I saw this scar. It ran all the way down his left arm, jagged like it didn't heal right." Roscoe scribbled furiously in his notebook while Calloway kept her eyes locked on Dana. "You saw his arm? Did he grab you?" Dana nodded slowly. "He did, one hand on my shoulder and the other on the hammer." Her voice wavered as her memories boiled to the surface. "I didn't even notice it at first. I screamed, but no one was around to hear me." "What happened next?" Roscoe asked quietly from the corner. Dana clenched her hands together like she was bracing herself. He didn't say a word, just swung the hammer at me. I don't know how I moved in time, but it missed my head and hit my arm. That's when I fell and he laughed. Not normal laughing, it was like he enjoyed watching me crawl. The room fell silent for a moment, the only sound coming from the beeping of Dana's heart monitor. Calloway leaned forward cautiously. "Dana, how did you escape?" A desperate struggle. Dana took a shaky breath, recounting the chaos of her escape. After that first swing, she scrambled backward across the wet grass, her injured arm useless as she screamed for help. The man raised the hammer again, and in his sick glee, she saw him hesitate, just for a moment, like he wanted to savor her fear. It was that hesitation that saved her. "I kicked him," she said, a flicker of defiance flashing in her eyes. "Right in the knee. It wasn't much, but it threw him off balance. I ran as fast as I could up the street, banging on doors, and finally, someone answered." "That hesitation," Calloway muttered to herself. "He's not just attacking, he's performing." Dana nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's like the fear, it feeds him." The neighbor who opened their door, a retired Army veteran, had called 911 immediately. The suspect was gone by the time the police arrived, leaving behind only Dana's shattered arm and a chilling reminder that he wasn't afraid to miss. He'd kill when the timing was right. The killer's sloppy mistake. The attack on Dana Ledbetter marked a shift in the investigation. For the first time, Calloway and her team had something concrete. A scar, a pattern of behavior, a living witness traumatized yet determined to help. Forensics at the scene picked up faint boot prints in the grass, matching the muddy prints left behind at the Smith and Martinez homes. But what caught Calloway's attention was the torn piece of fabric recovered from a nearby bush, a scrap of black nylon, likely from his jacket. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible. "He slipped," Roscoe muttered, holding up the evidence bag. "He's starting to get careless. Profile strengthens." Back in the precinct, Calloway met with Dr. Eleanor Hart to refine the killer's psychological profile using Dana's testimony. "The hesitation she mentioned," Calloway said. "That moment where he stopped, what do you make of it?" Hart ran a finger along the whiteboard where their theories were scrawled like a chaotic mind map. "He's controlled, precise, but he's not a machine. That hesitation? It's about power. He wants to feel it, her fear, her helplessness. He doesn't just want to kill, he wants to dominate." "So why didn't he finish the job?" Roscoe asked, pacing the room. "Maybe she wasn't enough," Hart replied coldly. "Maybe he thrives on the act but can't manage chaos. She fought back and that wasn't part of his plan." "That means he's not invincible," Calloway said firmly. "He can be rattled." The fallout Dana's survival sparked headlines across the Pacific Northwest. "Escape from the hammer of death," read one paper. Though sensationalized, the story reignited public panic. More calls flooded the precinct, false alarms, conspiracies, and frantic whispers about supposed sightings. For Calloway, though, the focus was simple. Dana's account was a gift. A thread to pull that would hopefully unravel the Oregon butcher's facade. The scar, the laughter, the scavenged nylon. They weren't much, but in the endless hunt for a ghost, even the smallest crumb felt monumental. The spark of hope. Before leaving Dana's room that night, Calloway squeezed her hand gently. "You were brave," she said. "Braver than I think even you know. Because of you, he's not invisible anymore." Dana blinked back tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just catch him. Don't let him do this to anyone else." As Calloway stepped out of the hospital into the biting December air, she allowed herself a rare flicker of hope. For the first time in months, the butcher wasn't just an untouchable shadow lurking in the dark. He was a man who bled, who made mistakes, who could be caught. And for Calloway, that was enough to keep the hunt going. Catching the butcher. By March 2005, the Oregon butcher's reign of terror had stretched every nerve of law enforcement to its breaking point. For months, he had evaded capture, slipping like smoke through bus terminals, train stations, and wooded areas. He had left behind blood-soaked scenes and grieving families, daring detectives to catch a shadow. But shadows, as Detective Sarah Calloway learned, always left traces. That month, an anonymous tip from a construction foreman in Seattle changed everything. "We've got this guy working the site," the foreman said, his voice crackling through the precinct's phone line. "He's odd, quiet, always keeps to himself, and he's always carrying this busted-up hammer in his bag. Nobody really questioned it, but I saw the news and thought someone should check it out." The call Calloway's instincts lit up as soon as she heard the word hammer. The tip might have been nothing. Strange workers weren't exactly rare on construction crews, but this time the timing felt too exact. Too perfect. Did he have anything unusual about him? Scars? Injuries? Calloway asked, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. Yeah, the foreman replied after a pause. He's got this nasty scar on his left arm, runs all the way down, like someone opened him up with a damn machete and didn't bother to stitch it right. Calloway exchanged a sharp glance with Officer Roscoe, who was already bolting toward the evidence board. A scar on his left arm, the same detail Dana Ledbetter, the only survivor, had described in painstaking detail months prior. That's him, Roscoe muttered, grabbing his coat. It's gotta be. The surveillance. Instead of barging in, Calloway decided to use patience, a skill that had been eroded after months of frustration. This time she wouldn't let adrenaline ruin their shot. The FBI task force in Seattle PD coordinated immediately, setting up discreet surveillance on the construction site where the suspect, who used the name John Tylor on his work records, had recently been employed. John Tylor, or whoever he truly was, fit every fragment of their profile. A drifter avoiding personal interactions, paying in cash, moving from place to place without drawing attention. Surveillance confirmed he rarely spoke to co-workers, often remained after hours, and always carried his tattered leather backpack. On day 3 of surveillance, officers noted the handle of a hammer protruding from the bag. But what struck Calloway during those long hours of watching the suspect wasn't the hammer or even his isolated demeanor, it was his calm. He moved with the eerie ease of a man who believed he'd never be caught. This guy, Roscoe muttered through gritted teeth, watching Tylor sit casually on a pile of wooden beams during break time. He's not panicking. He's not looking over his shoulder. It's like he knows we're out here and doesn't give a damn. He's careful because he knows control is the only thing keeping him hidden, Calloway replied flatly. Well, we're about to take it from him. The arrest. On March 18, 2005, the task force made its move. Early in the morning, as the construction site was just beginning to stir, a group of plainclothes officers, armed but disguised as workers, approached Tylor in the lot where he sat pouring coffee into a chipped thermos. Calloway and Roscoe coordinated from a surveillance van parked down the street, nerves tight as wire. Approach from his left, keep his hands visible, Calloway murmured over the radio, her eyes locked on the grainy feed of the cameras mounted near the site. He's a hammer guy, which means close combat. Don't give him the chance. As one officer approached under the pretense of asking a question about tools, the extraction team closed in. Seattle PD! Don't move! One of them shouted, their firearms drawn and aimed squarely at his chest. For a moment, a single heart-stopping moment, Tylor's eyes flickered with something Calloway hadn't anticipated, amusement. He didn't flinch, didn't panic. Instead, he smiled faintly, as though he'd been waiting for this all along. Well, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Guess I had to meet you folks sooner or later. He made no attempt to run. His hands rose slowly, deliberately, and when officers pulled the battered leather bag off his shoulder, the hammer fell out first, followed by a spare shirt soaked in dried mud and a twisted bracelet, later identified as belonging to Ellie Ransom, one of the sisters killed in Vancouver. The interrogation. The first night in custody felt like a win, but it was far from over. Calloway watched from behind the one-way glass as Tylor sat in the interrogation room, his gaze lazily fixed on the ceiling, as if he were bored. Do you think he'll talk? Roscoe asked, leaning heavily on the wall, exhaustion etched into his features. He's not stupid, Calloway replied. He won't say anything unless it's on his terms. But he wants to talk, I can feel it. He needs us to know who he is. He's too calculated not to. When Calloway finally entered the room, Tylor's gaze slid over to her with the indifference of a man watching a stranger on television. Detective, he drawled, smirking slightly. You've been looking for me a long time. Her spine stiffened, but she wouldn't let him rattle her. You killed 11 people, she said bluntly, sliding crime scene photos across the table toward him. Families, children. Tylor barely glanced at the photos, his expression unchanging. Did I? He mused, leaning back in his chair. Or did they die because no one stopped me sooner? His eyes glinted, dark and mocking. I'm just doing what I have to do. You're the ones who let it happen. Calloway's stomach churned, but she leaned in, her voice steady. You don't scare me, John. Whatever you think you're in control of, it's over. You slipped, you made mistakes, and now everyone knows you're nothing but a man who beats families to death with a hammer and runs. For the first time, his smirk faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, and that's when Calloway knew. They had him. Justice delivered. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Forensic evidence from his bag and belongings tied Tylor directly to every murder. His DNA matched samples found at the Smith and Martinez homes. Victims' items, the fire truck, the bracelet, were trophies, each carefully chosen and kept to remind him of his crimes. In 2006, John Tylor stood trial for 11 counts of first-degree murder. His defense team attempted to argue insanity, citing childhood trauma and psychopathy, but the jury saw through it. After weeks of emotional testimonies from surviving family members, the verdict was swift: guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. As she watched his face when the sentence was read, Calloway felt no satisfaction, no peace. Only the weight of what couldn't be undone. 11 lives, gone, 11 stories left unfinished. But for the first time in over a year, there was also silence. No more screams, no more hammer strikes echoing in their nightmares. The aftermath. Back at the precinct, Roscoe clinked his coffee mug lightly against Calloway's. "We got him," he said softly. "It's over." "It's never really over," Calloway murmured, staring at the evidence board, now void of any new pins or photos. For her, the Oregon butcher wasn't just another case, it was a scar, one she'd carry for the rest of her life. "But at least," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow, "no one else will die at his hands." The historic trial. The courtroom was packed long before the trial began. It wasn't just the families of the victims filling the scarred wooden benches behind the prosecution table. It was an audience of a nation gripped by the infamous story of the Oregon butcher. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, but outside reporters lined the steps of the Multnomah County Courthouse, snapping photos of every grim-faced police officer, tight-lipped prosecutor, and teary-eyed family member who entered. Inside, Detective Sarah Calloway sat near the back of the prosecution's side, her body rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. To her, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of justice that morning. It felt like a pressure chamber. The weight of 11 lives lost pulsed in the air, a silence so heavy that even the creak of the courtroom doors seemed deafening. The trial of John Tylor had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with the unimaginable, the defendant's presence. When Tylor entered the courtroom in his orange prison jumpsuit, escorted by 2 armed guards, the reaction was instant and visceral. A murmur swept over the audience like the pull of a wave. Grieving mothers and fathers stiffened in their seats, leaning forward like they wanted to leap over the barrier separating them from the man who had shattered their lives. The way Tylor walked, you would almost forget he was on trial for 11 murders. He wasn't hunched over or restrained by fear. He stepped forward as if he owned the room, his gaze unbothered by the sea of anger and grief aimed at him. Calloway locked her eyes on him, studying every detail of his demeanor. His movements were measured, his facial expression as blank as ever. Only someone who had spent months dissecting his mind, connecting the dots between his kills, would notice the subtle smirk tugging at the edge of his lips. That smirk carried one message. This was a game, and he was still playing. Opening statements. The lead prosecutor, Michelle Langford, rose to deliver her opening statement. A seasoned attorney with silver streaks in her hair and a booming voice that carried authority, she methodically laid out the case for the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone heavy with purpose, "this trial is about more than murder. It is about terror, control, and the destroyed lives of 11 people, mothers, fathers, and children, whose only crime was living in homes this man deemed to be his playground for violence." Langford didn't bother softening her approach. She wanted the jury to feel the full weight of Tylor's crimes right away. "Over the course of this trial," she continued, her piercing gaze moving from juror to juror, "we will show you the evidence, a trail of terror that stretches across Oregon and beyond, tied together by this man sitting here today." She pointed, her finger unwavering. "We will present physical evidence, boot prints matching his, DNA recovered from scenes of horror, and trophies he carried as reminders of his victims' pain. Most importantly, you will hear from the witnesses, the families, and the survivor who lived to tell the world who the monster truly is." When Langford returned to her seat, there wasn't a single sound in the room. Every pair of eyes burned with focused attention. Even the jury, their faces typically unreadable, appeared visibly shaken. The defense team, however, had a different approach. Lead defense attorney Raymond Greer stood with a calm, measured voice that contrasted sharply with the storm the prosecution had unleashed. "John Tylor is a man caught in a system designed to vilify," Greer said, one hand resting firmly on the defendant's table. "What you will see over the course of this trial will challenge what you think you know about justice. We are not here to defend murder, but to reckon with the story behind it. A story of a man whose brokenness has taken him to a place none of us can understand. Let us not jump to simple conclusions about complexity. It was the first hint of their defense strategy: insanity. The survivor's testimony. The courtroom buzzed when Dana Ledbetter took the stand. Every head turned as the young woman entered, her cast finally removed but scars still visible against her pale skin. Her journey had been one of determination, clawing her way back from the trauma inflicted the night Tylor swung his hammer at her. Langford approached gently, her tone soft as she addressed the witness. "Dana, I know this is incredibly difficult, but can you tell this jury in your own words what happened that night?" Dana glanced nervously toward Tylor, whose expression remained disturbingly neutral, before whispering, "He came out of nowhere. I thought I was going to die." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Dana described the attack, the hammer, the chilling laughter, and the way her fear seemed to feed Tylor. She recounted her desperate escape, the moment she kicked him and ran, and the terror she carried ever since. When the defense cross-examined, they attempted to rattle her, suggesting her memory might be fogged by fear or exaggerated by months of media attention. But Dana surprised everyone. She didn't waver, didn't flinch. "He looked at me like I wasn't even human," she said, her voice steady, "like I was just something he could break." Calloway watched in quiet awe. Dana's courage in the face of the monster who had nearly killed her was more powerful than any evidence they could submit, the prosecution's knockout blow. As the trial pressed on, the prosecution's case grew ironclad. Forensic analysts testified about the DNA evidence, a match between Tylor and samples found at the Smith and Martinez homes. Crime scene photographs, though sparingly presented so as not to overwhelm the jury, painted a vivid image of Tylor's calculated brutality. And then there were the trophies found in his leather backpack: Ellie Ransom's bracelet, Dylan Smith's small red fire truck, and dozens of other stolen memories from homes he turned into nightmares. Langford's final push came in the form of Tylor's psychological profile, presented by Dr. Eleanor Hart, a criminal psychologist who had been brought in to analyze his behavior. "This is not a man who suddenly snapped," Hart declared emphatically. "This is a man who planned, a man who hunted. There is no confusion, no chaos in his patterns. This is cold, deliberate calculation." The defense's final gambit. The defense leaned heavily on an insanity plea, claiming Tylor was a product of horrific childhood abuse, citing records of foster homes and early signs of psychopathy. They called psychiatrists who described his mental state as beyond rationality, suggesting he lacked full awareness of his actions. Langford didn't let it slide. During her rebuttal, she approached the jury with conviction. If he was truly a man without reason, then why did he clean his tracks so carefully? Why did he hide from cameras, police, and witnesses? Why did he steal these trophies to relive his crimes, to exert control even after the act? That is not insanity, that is evil. The verdict. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom after 6 hours of deliberation, every person in the room held their breath. Tylor's face remained unflinching, though his hands tightened against the table. Calloway knew it wasn't nerves. He wanted to see how his final performance had been received. The head juror spoke with steady clarity. "We find the defendant, John Tylor, guilty on all 11 counts of first-degree murder." Gasps of relief swept across the courtroom. Tears streamed down the faces of victims' families as Tylor sat motionless. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "John Tylor, the court sentences you to death by lethal injection." Closure amid the chaos. For the families of the victims, the trial's conclusion brought a bittersweet sense of justice. It wouldn't bring back who they lost, but it closed a chapter that had haunted them. Calloway stood outside the courthouse steps as the news crews swarmed. She gazed out at the crowd, knowing the Oregon butcher was no longer a shadow. He had been brought into the light where he could no longer hurt anyone. Roscoe found her moments later, patting her shoulder. "We did it." "We did," she replied softly, and yet as the courthouse loomed behind her, she couldn't shake the weight of the lives Tylor had taken. Justice had been done, but the scars left behind would never truly heal. Epilogue, a scar on the soul. Even as the Oregon butcher awaited his execution, his name became a grim part of history. For Calloway, the case would never really leave her. It lingered like an ache, a constant reminder of the lives touched by one man's unthinkable darkness. But as she folded away the case files for the last time, one thought brought her solace. They had stopped him. He would never hurt anyone again. And for that, even amidst grief, there was peace. A wake-up call. The Oregon butcher case, with its horrifying brutality and wide-reaching terror, became more than a story of one man's dark, twisted crimes. It became a cultural reckoning, a defining moment that forced both law enforcement and society at large to confront the cracks in their systems. For years, the Pacific Northwest had taken pride in its serene neighborhoods and sturdy sense of community, places where porch lights glowing at night symbolize safety, and neighbors crossing the street to borrow sugar was a sign of trust. But the murders shattered those illusions. Across Oregon, Washington, and even the nation, the echoes of this case didn't just resound in courtrooms and precincts. They rippled through living rooms, schools, newsrooms, and the halls of government. When the Oregon butcher was finally behind bars, there was a collective breath of relief, but it was quickly followed by a deep, unsettling question. How did this happen? The breakdown of trust. Detective Sarah Calloway stood in front of a packed crowd at the Multnomah County Community Hall 3 weeks after John Tylor's trial ended. The event had been organized by local officials, a forum meant to help residents process the trauma their neighborhoods had endured. But Calloway could feel the tension in the room. Anger, fear, and most painfully of all, distrust. A woman wearing a thick coat despite the heating raised her hand, her voice trembling as she asked, "What do we do now, detective? We were told this community was safe, that monsters like him couldn't just walk into our homes." Calloway took a deep breath before answering. "This wasn't just a failure of safety," she began carefully. "This was a failure of awareness. Systems meant to protect our most vulnerable, mental health systems, neighborhood safety networks, and yes, even law enforcement wore blinders for too long. Tylor didn't become a killer overnight. People like him slipped through cracks that we've ignored for years." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mixture of agreement and indignation. Another man stood, his face flushed with emotion. "So you're saying this is everyone's fault? What were we supposed to do? Read his mind, predict this?" "No," Calloway said firmly, locking her gaze on the man. "But ignoring warning signs doesn't make them go away. Tylor was more than just a ghost in the woods. He lived among us. He worked jobs, took buses, and roamed neighborhoods unnoticed. He wore the mask of being ordinary while planning the unthinkable. We need to get better at noticing the masks, the warning signs of a broken system." The Oregon butcher's story was a tragedy in every sense, one born not just from a violent individual but from a system unequipped to handle someone like him. John Tylor's path to becoming one of the Pacific Northwest's most prolific killers was littered with red flags that had been ignored or brushed aside. Foster homes and juvenile centers had filed records about his violent outbursts as a teen. Teachers had struggled with a child whose scars spoke louder than his words. Mental health professionals had flagged him as a potential danger to himself and others, but, like far too many at-risk individuals, he had slipped through the cracks. "What happened with Tylor is something we've seen before," said Dr. Eleanor Hart, the profiler who had helped build the psychological case against him. During a late-night interview for a true crime documentary, she reflected on the case. "We take young people who've been abused, neglected, or traumatized and fail to give them the help they need before it's too late. Then, when they erupt like this, we sit back and wonder how it could have happened. It's not a mystery, it's a failure of support." Hart paused for a moment, her tone softening. "That's not an excuse for what he did. He made choices, heinous ones, and he deserves every second of his punishment. But if we don't address the conditions that create people like him, there will be more Tylors." The Oregon butcher case spurred a push for systemic change in how states responded to individuals with violent tendencies or mental health issues. Community leaders called for increased funding for early intervention programs, stricter monitoring of juveniles flagged as dangerous, and improved reporting systems for concerning behavior. But implementing those changes wouldn't happen overnight, and everyone knew it. A community rebuilt. The psychological impact of the butcher's reign of terror ran deep within affected communities. Parents clutched their children tighter. Houses that once stood proud with open floors and wide windows now bristled with new locks, cameras, and security lights. Small-town innocence had been exchanged for a sense of anxious self-preservation. In Maple Crest, home to the first victims, memorials to the Smith family were found on nearly every street corner. Teddy bears, candles, and handwritten notes blanketed the sidewalks, standing as both remembrance and a warning for all who walked those streets. A young local father named Justin Greer, who had lived across the street from the Smiths, became one of the most vocal advocates for change. At a town hall meeting, he held up a flyer advertising a neighborhood watch program he started. "We told ourselves it couldn't happen here," he said, his voice shaking with anger and grief. "And then it did. We need to stop pretending that our zip codes make us immune to this kind of horror. It can happen anywhere, and it's on us to make sure it doesn't happen again." Greer's warning resonated far beyond Maple Crest. Suburbs across Oregon began establishing extensive neighborhood safety committees, hiring private security firms, and even setting up non-profit organizations dedicated to crime awareness and survivor support. Lessons for the nation. The Butcher case didn't just leave Oregon changed, it sent a ripple effect through the entire country. National debates over public safety, mental health care, and systemic accountability erupted in the media. Some commentators focused on the cracks in America's mental health infrastructure, rallying for bipartisan support for funding and reform. Others pointed fingers at law enforcement, accusing police forces of failing to protect their communities by not connecting the dots sooner. Detective Calloway found herself in the center of these debates, her voice both respected and scrutinized. During an appearance on a national news segment, the host asked her bluntly, "Does this case prove that law enforcement is reactive, not proactive?" Calloway didn't flinch. "It proves we can't always be everywhere at once," she admitted. "But it also proves we can do better. We can communicate better between agencies, keep better track of patterns, and take citizens' concerns seriously before a crisis happens. It's on law enforcement, yes, but it's also on all of us. Safety isn't just a job, it's a shared responsibility." The scar left behind. Years after John Tylor's arrest, the Oregon Butcher's name remained etched into the fabric of the nation's memory. True crime podcasts dissected every part of his life, documentaries recreated his crimes with eerie precision, and libraries held books that asked the hardest questions. Could we have stopped this sooner? For Detective Calloway, the case wasn't just a shadow that followed her, it was a scar carved into her soul. She carried the faces of his victims with her, a mourning that kept her awake at night even as she knew justice had been done. But there was a part of her that found solace in the wake-up call that followed his capture. In the foundations rebuilt, the systems improved, and the conversations reshaped. As she walked through the streets of Maple Crest years later, she noticed families gathering together at new block parties, children playing under watchful eyes, and a banner that read, "We will never forget, but we will move forward." For Calloway, that banner summed up everything the case had left behind. The wounds didn't close, but the lessons had been learned, and in those lessons there was hope.